Hello everyone, Cowbunger here, and I have been thinking pretty hard about Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2. The game has lived rent-free in my head since it was announced, and it is coming out very soon. I am loving everything that I have seen about this game, especially gameplay, but a sour spot that many people have shared in regards to this sequel is its roster. It has been confirmed that 11 veterans are not coming back to Nick All-Star Brawl 2, and the initial roster size is just as big as Nick All-Star Brawl 1 after its DLC. Many people have been disappointed by this, and I can't really blame them. For me, it's not a deal breaker, and I feel pretty fine about the roster we are getting. I still plan on buying the game and its DLC day 1, but others have had much more negative reactions towards the roster. Along with that, all the DLC characters have actually been revealed, so now I have to go back and re-record some stuff here. Iroh, Zuko, Mr. Krabs, and Rocksteady are going to be your DLC lineup, and this is just another blow for people who already thought the roster was mediocre and wanted some new series represented. I still think the DLC roster is pretty good, especially Mr. Krabs and Zuko. I do think that the roster choices are bizarre enough to warrant criticism, which is why I'm making this video. Fighting game rosters, specifically platform fighters at this point, have to be a good combination of safe picks, popular picks, and out of left field picks. For a sequel like this, it seems like people would also expect most of the veterans to return because they got spoiled by Smash Ultimate. It does seem like Nick All-Star Brawl 2's roster leans a little too heavily into the out of left field picks for some people's liking. I still like the roster personally, but I can't agree that there are characters not here that I would have personally rather have seen than what we have got. I do like how the devs and Nickelodeon are just seeming to pick the characters that they personally like, along with fan favorites as newcomers of the game, but there is an ideal roster that they are kind of sacrificing in order to make the other, weirder characters a reality. So here's what I think the most ideal Nick All-Star Brawl 2 roster would be, one that keeps the restraints that the devs had to work with. That means the roster will still be 25 characters for the base game. Then we will add 4 additional characters through the DLC pass that does not represent new franchises. Along with that, just for fun, I will speculate what 2 other DLC passes could bring us. And of course, this is just my list of characters. If your list of characters looks different, try to be nice about it when you're telling me that, okay? So with all that exposition out of the way, let us begin with the base roster. So obviously the first characters that need to be added in this game are going to be SpongeBob and Patrick. In every Nickelodeon crossover game, SpongeBob is playable. It is as concrete as death and taxes. And usually Patrick is not too far behind. This duo might as well be the biggest game sellers on the roster. As soon as kids or parents see either one of them on the cover, they're gonna want the game. SpongeBob is probably the biggest Nickelodeon original franchise on the roster, so it's safe to assume we'll have more than just SpongeBob and Patrick on the roster. And we will, because I am adding Squidward as well. I think the dynamic between SpongeBob and Squidward is a very memorable part about the show. The two foil off of each other so well and have some of the funniest interactions. I also think the dynamic between SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward is great too. Squidward having to deal with their childlike antics makes for some great comedic punchlines and stories. Obviously, SpongeBob is the star of the show, but he would not be as entertaining if he didn't have characters like Patrick and Squidward by his side. Now, one place where all 3 of these characters interact with each other frequently is the Krusty Krab. The 2 main recurring characters that are usually hanging out in the Krusty Krab are Mr. Krabs and Plankton. However, I'm only going to be adding one of these characters to the base roster, and that is Plankton. Seeing how villains will play a big role in the campaign mode, it makes sense for one of Nick's most iconic villains to be playable. The fact that he pilots a mech is a very unique idea as well, and you're not going to be able to achieve that with many other Nick characters. So that is all the SpongeBob characters I plan on having in the base roster. However, for my DLC pass, I am going to include Mr. Krabs. Why? Because first of all, him being DLC is too perfect to pass up. It's almost like he's saying, "You better pay up or else I'm not gonna fight, boyo." And along with that, I just feel like he's the last big SpongeBob character missing in the roster, besides Sandy, of course. After all, this isn't SpongeBob and other All-Stars Brawl. And when I look at the hierarchy of which SpongeBob characters are the most important to include to the least important, I would say Sandy is probably the 6th most important character to add, in my opinion. I don't dislike Sandy. I actually think she's in some of the most legendary episodes in the series, some of my favorites for sure, but I feel like everybody above her has a track record of being a part of the show more. I mean, everyone but Plankton appeared in the first episode, so I really do think this is the best we can do with the SpongeBob characters represented. Next, let's talk about the franchise that will surely have the second most amount of characters, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Again, another titan for Nickelodeon that will easily sell copies based on which characters are included alone. Of course we have to get Aang in here. He is the Avatar master of all 4 elements and the main character. Now, when adding other Avatar characters to the roster, I wanted to include the secondary characters that helped shape Aang into the master he ended up becoming. I think they are the most important and obvious characters to include alongside Aang, and they are all fan favorites within the series too, so it's a win-win. So, let's add Aang's trainers, Katara, Toph, and Zuko. Each of these characters joined Aang on his journey to becoming Avatar and to beat Fire Lord Ozai. They also taught him how to use their respective elements. So in a way, they are the masters of the master, and I think they definitely deserve to be here. Each of them would play drastically different from one another as well, as they have distinct fighting styles along with their unique bending abilities. I am not going to be adding any more Avatar characters in DLC, so this is your definitive Avatar lineup. There's one more character we have to talk about before moving on, of course, and that is Korra. Korra is from another series technically, but I think we all consider her an Avatar character, and I'm not cutting her. She is another master of all elements, and her playstyle would be more headstrong than Aang's. In terms of other Avatar or Korra characters, while I think some of them are pretty important, most of them play a smaller role in the overall story of both shows. I think Azula or Ozai could be cool bosses, but that's about all I would do for additional Avatar character inclusions. Next, we have another big franchise to cover that will have multiple characters, and that is TMNT. Because of course we need to represent it, everybody loves TMNT. If you have heard me talk about how I feel about the TMNT character inclusions in both games, then you know what I'm about to do. I am adding all 4 turtles to my roster. That is the most logical thing to do. For me, it's extremely strange that both Nickelodeon or Brawl games have excluded 2 turtles from being playable. For me, you either add all of them or none of them. To do any sort of in-between just doesn't feel right. As for other TMNT characters, I have decided not to include any more. So no April or Shredder as playable characters this time around. I still would like Shredder to be a boss though. Alright, we have one more big franchise that will have multiple characters in the roster to cover, and that is Loud House. I don't care for this franchise too much, but there's no denying that this is probably the only relatively new franchise worth representing in the base game. Because of its breakout success, I think this franchise deserves 3 character slots. Obviously, the first 2 are going to Lincoln and Lucy Loud. As for character number 3, I've decided to go with Luna Loud. Luna is here for one main reason, because spoiler alert, I do not have Ember on the roster. I do like the idea of a character who attacks using musical instruments, so I think Luna will be a nice fit that would play pretty similar to how Ember plays now. We can make Ember a boss too, she will work well in that role. Alright, the rest of this roster will only have one character representing their franchise. This will make it so that we can represent as many series as possible. I try to get a good variety of old and somewhat new characters onto the roster, and just remember, we have DLC 1 to give some of these franchises 2 characters. For example, for the base game Rugrats representation, I have picked Reptar. Reptar is just a dinosaur, who doesn't want to play as Reptar? With that being said, in DLC 1, I do have another Rugrats character slated to join the battle, and it is none other than Tommy Pickles. Tommy is basically the main character of Rugrats, and it does feel weird that he is not in the game. Sure, you could bring up the whole, Nick probably doesn't want to have a character where a baby is getting punched, but like, Lucy is 8 years old, that's not much better. The thing about Tommy is that not only will he get beaten up, but he will beat everybody else up too. If the baby can dish out some damage, then I say fair game. It's all cartoon violence at the end of the day. Nobody's really getting hurt here. Okay, up next, let's get a big franchise out of the way. Garfield is in the roster. Again, I kind of get the arguments from some people when they say that Garfield doesn't really feel like a Nick All-Star, since he hasn't had any recent shows on Nickelodeon, unlike TMNT for example. But Garfield is just a game seller, just like SpongeBob, Avatar, TMNT, and Loud House. He needs to be here just for the fact that he'll get a lot of eyes on the game. Our next characters are Ren and Stimpy. This one is self-explanatory. Just like Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy was a revolutionary show in the early life of Nickelodeon programming. It would be a crime not to include them. No Power Toast Man in this roster as much as I love him. Next is Rocco. Pretty much the same deal as Rugrats and Ren and Stimpy. It would just feel wrong to not include one of the biggest shows in Nick's early programming. The last character I want to include from the 1990s is Helga from Hey Arnold. She was in the first game and she is the most obvious choice for a Hey Arnold rep besides Arnold. And speaking of Arnold, I'm going to be adding him in DLC 1. Again, it's very strange how it almost feels like the main characters of these franchises get left out for seemingly no good reason. But I see him more as a character who is just having fun doing whatever, and you are collateral damage of that. In a way, I think he'd play pretty similar to Gerald. And speaking of him, he should probably be in Arnold's Super. Arnold's bedroom would be a fun stage too. So that means there are no All Real Monsters, no Angry Beavers, no Cat Dog, and no Wild Thornberry representatives. It's really tough to not have any of them on the roster, but one criticism I saw of the first game's roster was that there were a lot of 1990s characters. So I figured the best thing to do would add more modern characters through the bigger franchises. We will discuss the 1990s again, don't worry, but for now we will move on to the 2000 reps. And the first one I have here is Zim. Invader Zim has a cult following, and Zim and Gur are just extremely popular characters. They definitely deserve to be here. And of course I'm talking about Gur being a part of Zim's moveset, okay? And I have to be honest, I think a big part of the show is missing from both games. So for my last DLC 1 character, I'm going to be adding Dib. The dynamic between Zim and Dib is what makes Invader Zim so great to me. I've already talked about how foils and a character's importance in general should determine who gets into the roster. And for me, Dib is the most important character in his franchise right along Zim. For our next 2000s rep, I have Jimmy Neutron in the roster. Jimmy was extremely popular back in the day, and it was one of my favorite cartoons personally. So there's no reason for him not to be here. That means Hugh got the boot though, but I think most Jimmy Neutron fans won't mind too much that Jimmy got in over his dad with the roster constraints we had. The next character on my roster is Jenny from My Life as a Teenage Robot. This franchise also has a cult following, and Jenny was the most requested DLC character for the first game, so it would be criminal to not include her here. And finally, character 25 is of course Danny Phantom. Danny Phantom was extremely popular, and Danny appears in most crossover games, so he needs to be here too. So with that, we have our base roster and first DLC roster ready to go. I'd say this is much more ideal than what Nick All-Star Brawl 2 is going to end up doing. There are still some fan favorites missing though, and I would still not blame you if you found this roster overall to be disappointing. So that's why I've come up with 2 other DLC packs. These DLC packs will serve specific purposes to hopefully round out the roster even more. My second DLC pass will exclusively include 4 characters from franchises that are new to the Nick All-Star Brawl games. And my third DLC pass will bring back 4 veterans who are cut from the first roster. I think it's realistic to think that we are only going to have 2 DLC passes at most, but why not do 3 if you can? Let's really bolster this roster and make the game an undeniable purchase. So let's uncover DLC 2 first. The first character representing a new franchise that hasn't appeared before is El Tigre. So yes, with my base roster there's no El Tigre representation, but this DLC will finally give El Tigre his chance to shine. No pun intended. Next character is actually new, and it is Otis from Back at the Barnyard. This is another highly requested character that I think is definitely deserving a spot as DLC. Character number 3 is the newest franchise represented in the game, and it is Miko from Glitch Techs. While not super popular, I think it makes all the sense in the world for Nico to be included in this game. Her whole thing is getting rid of glitches in video games, so it makes a lot of sense for her to appear in this game. And for character number 4, we're going to go back to the 1990s to grab someone who's in Nick All-Star Brawl's 2 roster. Or rather, 2 beavers, because Daggett and Norbert are here. I love the Angry Beavers in Nick All-Star Brawl 2. Their tag mechanic is sick, and I would love to see it get in the game through DLC. Now, for DLC 3, we have 4 veterans from Nick All-Star Brawl 1 to bring back. First one I would bring back is Oblina. Oblina was just a cool character, and she's from a franchise that doesn't get much love nowadays, so if a veterans only DLC pack existed, she should definitely be a part of it. Next we have Nigel Thornberry. This one just makes sense. He was a fan favorite in the first game, so bringing him back, if you could, would be great. Cat Dog is next because they were one of the most unique characters in Nick All-Star Brawl 1. I heard they were hard to program and they kinda did break in some way in every other patch in Nick All-Star Brawl 1, but you just gotta find a way to make it work. I personally think they don't need the stance change mechanic from the first game. Just do something that makes them viable to code this time around. And for the last veteran to return, it really couldn't be anybody else but Hugh Neutron. He got into Nick All-Star Brawl 1 by popular demand, so his absence in Nick All-Star Brawl 2 will be felt. He is just the people's champ. If you have a chance to add him in DLC, I'd say you definitely take that chance. So look at this roster now. I think this is definitely worthy of the Nick All-Star moniker. Even if Nick All-Star Brawl 2's roster ends up being vastly different than this one, I think we could all hope that something that kinda looks like this could end up being the roster for Nick All-Star Brawl 3, if that game gets made anyway. Honestly, I think that the post-launch support for Nick All-Star Brawl 2 will definitely determine whether or not that's gonna happen, so definitely keep a close eye on it. I know I will. Thank you all for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. What would your roster look like? Which characters are you bringing back and which ones are you dropping? Thank you to my channel members that I'm showing on the screen. All supporters of the channel get exclusive video content along with other perks. I will see you all in the next video, and I'm hoping that you all join me when I'm actually playing the game. Bye.